You know, back in 2007, Nokia didn't just sell a lot of phones. They sold more than their next three biggest competitors combined. They weren't just the market leader, they were the market. And then, almost overnight, they vanished. Now, this isn't a story about a dumb company. It's a strategic autopsy. It's about how a company can be brilliant at all the wrong things, leading to a downfall that was as logical as it was tragic.
Okay, so how does a titan like that actually fall? Well, first, we're going to look at the sheer scale of their empire. Then we'll dig into how they so completely misunderstood the iPhone. After that, we'll uncover this invisible anchor that held them back, explore the civil war happening inside the company, and finally, trace the step-by-step logic of their failure.
Look, to really get why Nokia's fall was such a big deal, you have to appreciate the staggering height they fell from. This wasn't just another tech company. It was a global force, so powerful that the very idea of failure was, well, it was basically inconceivable, especially to them.
These numbers from 2007, they're just staggering. Nokia had 40% of the entire global mobile market. That's not just more than Samsung and Motorola, it's more than both of them put together. This wasn't market leadership, this was total domination.
But you know, market share? That's only half the picture. This 50%, that was Nokia's cut of the entire mobile industry's profits. Think about that. They weren't just selling the most phones, they were sucking up most of the money in the entire industry. Their power was just on another level.
Everything about Nokia, their whole identity, was built on this foundation of pure engineering dominance. Their phones were legends, right? Indestructible, affordable, batteries that lasted for days. Internally, what they were proudest of was execution speed, how fast they could design, build, and ship hardware. They were competing on engineering, not on user experience, and that's a crucial distinction.
And here's the crazy part. That very identity, their biggest strength, became this fatal lens that completely distorted how they saw the next big threat. Because it's not that they didn't see the iPhone coming. It's that when they looked at it, they saw it all wrong.
So, picture this. January 2007. Steve Jobs walks onto a stage and says Apple is going to reinvent the phone. Now, we know this event shattered Nokia's empire, but inside Nokia's headquarters, the initial analysis was calm, collected, and, as it turns out, catastrophically incorrect.
And this right here, this is the whole story in one slide. Nokia looked at the iPhone and saw a terrible phone. It was fragile, the battery was a joke, it was way too expensive, and where was the keyboard? To them, it was a toy, but Apple, they weren't even playing the same game. They were building a pocket computer that happened to make calls, focusing on software, apps, and user experience. Two companies looking at the same object, but seeing two totally different futures.
You hear this quote now and it just sounds, well, foolish. But it wasn't born from stupidity. It was a perfectly rational conclusion if you're living in their world, a world of hardware optimization and selling 1 billion phones. From that perspective, a fragile, expensive device with bad battery life, of course it's a niche product. They were just too smart at a game that was about to become obsolete.
So, okay, they misunderstood the threat from Apple and Google. We get that. But the real fight, the one they just couldn't win, was happening inside their own walls. It was a battle against this invisible anchor that their own success had created.
So let's talk about the real villain of this story, Symbian. This was Nokia's operating system, and for the old world of button phones, it was a masterpiece, efficient, stable, and it ran on hundreds of millions of devices, making them billions. It was their greatest asset and their most fatal liability.
The incentives here were just screaming at them. Sure, developers hated working with Symbian, and yeah, it was a nightmare to adapt for a touchscreen. But it was also the engine printing billions of dollars in revenue right now. To replace it meant you had to slow down, retrain entire teams, and basically admit your past strategy was wrong. So what did they do? They chose to protect the profitable present over building a risky future. They just kept patching a system that was fundamentally broken for the new world.
And this is such a critical point. Symbian wasn't failing. It was still making them a fortune. And that's the trap. The most dangerous software isn't the stuff that breaks. It's the legacy stuff that still works just fine. That steady cash flow created a kind of strategic inertia, a gravitational pull towards the past that was just impossible to escape.
So on top of this inertia from Symbian, you had a corporate structure that had gone from a strength to a massive weakness. You see, Nokia wasn't really one company anymore. It was more like a collection of warring kingdoms.
Here's the thing. Nokia didn't fail because of Apple. It failed because Nokia couldn't agree with Nokia. They had different teams, Symbian, MeeGo, Maemo, all fighting for the same budget, the same engineers. Managers were rewarded for protecting their own turf, not for moving the whole company forward. The result? Decisions took forever. Nobody wanted to take a real risk. There was no single, unified vision.
And that's the tragic irony of the whole thing, isn't it? They were so consumed with these internal battles over which OS was better, which feature was cooler. And while they were fighting in the hallways, Apple and Google were outside winning the real war. The war for developers, for apps, for entire ecosystems.
All right, so this brings us to the final act, the inevitable unraveling. And it wasn't one single bad decision. It was a series of moves that all seemed logical at the time, but they were made way too late. The panic was setting in.
By 2010, it was panic stations. Market share was in a free fall. So they hired an outsider, Stephen Alop, who made a huge, dramatic call. He said, "We are abandoning everything. Symbian, MeeGo, it's all gone." Instead, they were going to bet the entire farm on Microsoft's Windows Phone, trying to create a third ecosystem.
But it was a Hail Mary pass into a stadium that was already empty. The platform war between Apple and Google was over. A third ecosystem never stood a chance. And the result was just brutal. Just look at this. In 4 years, their smartphone market share went from a commanding 39% down to a tragic 3%. It was a complete evaporation.
And this really gets to the heart of it, to this idea of strategic inertia. It's what happens when the very things that made you successful become the reasons you can't survive. Nokia's strengths didn't just disappear, they expired. They became anchors, holding them to a world that didn't exist anymore.
So let's just lay out the brutal truth here. Nokia wasn't beaten because they stopped innovating. They were beaten because their past success made them afraid to take real risks. They were masters of hardware in a world that suddenly became all about software. And in the end, by focusing so hard on protecting their profitable present, they guaranteed they wouldn't have a future. They weren't beaten by a better phone. They were beaten by a better definition of what a phone was for.
And that leaves us with a really critical and, frankly, uncomfortable question for any successful organization out there today. It's the same question Nokia couldn't answer in time. What part of your business are you protecting that might actually be killing your future? The most dangerous moment for any company is when everything is still working perfectly, because that's when change feels optional, right up until the day it isn't.